Do I need to go up front?
Yeah, front.
Here? Hi, Colonel Donovan.
Good morning.
Morning. I'm Mrs. Cook. We have two classes in here now. They're all 12th graders. They've all been, we're beginning to read the things they carried and learn about the Vietnam War. So we really appreciate your flexibility in changing the date because of snow days and taking time out of your life to come and talk to us and give our students a firsthand account of what it was like for you during the war and after. And then if you don't mind, at the end, they may have some questions for you.
Oh, certainly, that'd be fine.
Thank you so much. And Mrs. Bixley is here as well. She's another teacher who is her class is in here as well.
And we've actually got quite a bit into the things they carried, so they might have some questions related to some of the stories that they've read, see if any of those experiences, kind of ring true for you at all. So.
Okay, fine. Good morning all, how are you?
Good morning.
What's the temperature up in Litchfield?
Freezing.
Freezing!
Let me not check my phone.
Well, I'm down in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and it's 18 right now.
Yeah, it's the same here.
Yeah, it's not supposed to be, out in Virginia, it's not supposed to be that cold. But I grew up in Bristol, so I have a little bit of idea of where you all are. And as a youngster, I used to fish in Bantam and Candlestick, and also
May
a
Donovan,
place
please, Jordan
called
Road.
Woods Creek. Woods Creek Pond up there. I've read O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried. He wrote that about, I think, 1990. And he is, in fact, a Vietnam veteran. And he refers in the book to serving with Company A, and in fact, he did serve with Company A, the 1st Battalion, 47th Infantry of the 196th Infantry Brigade in 1968-69 in Vietnam. I served 2 tours there, and I hate to say this, but my first tour in Vietnam was 50 years ago. And I just realized that a couple weeks ago when I realized that the anniversary of the Challenger explosion was also the anniversary of 50 years ago that I left for Vietnam, my first tour. And I came out of Germany. I was serving in the Army of Germany, and really didn't know that much about Vietnam, or I had an idea where it was, and we had no TV in Germany, or American TV back in those days, but we did have the Stars and Stripes newspaper, but there just wasn't a lot of news about it, or where it was. And as it turns out, I ended up as, I did not serve with an American unit. My first tour, I served as an advisor to a Montagnard long-range reconnaissance company. Do any of you know who the Montagnards are?
No.
Well, the Montagnards were tribal people. They came to Cochin, China in the 1500s from the Pacific, where they were Pacific Islanders. Were considered outcast by the native Cochin Chinese, and were driven inland into the mountains, away from the coast, and were then known as Montagnards, in French for the mountain people. And they were tribal. There were 4 or 5 tribes, spoke their own language, had their own ways, very, very, very different from anything I expected. And a very different society in that the Montagnard people were a matriarchal society. The women owned all the property. The women chose their partner. The women tended the fields, took care of the cattle, and the men were left to be warriors and hunters. Think back at it, that was a pretty nice arrangement for the guys. I mean, they got to go hunting and take a nap in the afternoon, and the women did all the work. And they were also fierce warriors. So we learned a lot about scouting and reconnaissance from those people. And if I can, I'm going to hold up a picture. This is myself on patrol with my weapons sergeant and some of our Montagnard scouts in 1966 in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, near Pleiku. One of the things that O'Brien refers to from time to time is the people's understanding of Vietnam War and what it was like. And there are probably more myths about Vietnam and the war than people realize as facts. One of the biggest myths is that, well, it was all fought by draftees. And in fact, the majority of the almost 3 million service members that served in Vietnam in uniform were volunteers. The great majority, more than 2/3 were volunteers. There were a total of 58,000 killed in Vietnam, which is an incredible number. But even more so amazing is the number that were severely wounded that lived because of new technologies. And one of those technologies was a helicopter that were able to go in and evacuate severely, critically wounded soldiers that in other wars would have died, but in Vietnam survived. Same is true today in Iraq and Afghanistan, that more and more severely injured warriors survive because of very brave pilots and crew members that rescue them. A lot of people think that, well, the very young were those that died in Vietnam. And in fact, more than 60% were 21 years old or older. And about a third of those that were killed were married. "97% of the almost 3 million veterans that served in Vietnam were honorably discharged. And of that group, 91% say that they were glad that they served. You know, you hear these stories, and you get some of it from O'Brien's book about how awful it was, et cetera, and it was. I mean, war in any shape, form, is awful to endure and to witness. But the majority said that they were glad they did it. They're glad they served. Because you could see on the ground how you were helping the Vietnamese people. Your folks will probably tell you that during the 1980s, most of the villains on TV shows were described as Vietnam veterans, which was not a very good thing to depict them. But the truth is that Vietnam veterans are the least likely to be in prison. Only 0.5% of Vietnam veterans have been jailed for crimes. I don't know if the lesson learned there is that we ought to send people to war so that they become better citizens or what, but it's a strange statistic, I think. And you hear every once in a while on TV or one of the talk shows or something about people claiming to be veterans or claiming military awards that they have not received, and it's called stolen valor. And it's, according to the Supreme Court, it's a right under the First Amendment. But it's a very interesting point that, you know, I said that there were about 3 million men, women that served in Vietnam in uniform. But there are 14 million who claim they did. That's 4 out of 5 who claim to be Vietnam veterans are not. I think that's almost disgraceful. You hear a lot about the draftees, and O'Brien refers to the draftees in his platoon, Lieutenant Cross's platoon. When in fact, 2/3 of the men who served in Vietnam were volunteers. 2/3. And in fact, I was halfway through my first tour in Vietnam when I got my draft notice. I was a captain, and I got my draft notice from the Bristol Draft Board saying I was being called to active duty, and I said, sorry fellas, I can't make it, I'm already here. Like I said, some of the stories that O'Brien talks about in the things they carried, interesting title, by the way. And he talks about the different members of the platoon in there and what they carried. You know, someone had a jackknife, and Kiowa carried his moccasins, and these strange things that we all carried. Well, I carried a a jackknife that I'd gotten. It's an Army jackknife that I got in Germany. But it was a special jackknife that was used for assembling demolitions. And it was made out of material that you could not get a spark from it accidentally, which if you're assembling demolitions is an important safety factor, if you think about it. And so I kept that, I carried that, and I carried a small can opener called a P38, and probably every once in a while on Facebook you'll see a picture of, what is this? It's a P38. So you could open your cans of sea rations and eat, and still have a couple of them around the house because they're handy when the power goes out and the can opener doesn't work, that sort of thing. And I think that O'Brien got the name for his book, The Things They Carried, because after the Vietnam Wall, the Vietnam Memorial Wall was built here in Washington off of Constitution Avenue in 1982, the park wardens started noticing that people were leaving different things at the wall. They were leaving letters that some GI had carried for years, letters to him from home that he carried in Vietnam. Strange little items and all. And those have all been collected over the years, over the 30 some odd years now since the wall went up, and are being shown a little at a time in a museum at the wall, and there is plans to build a larger museum to show these literally tens of thousands of objects that soldiers carried in Vietnam, and different things. Let me give you an example of one thing I carried. In Germany, I had a good friend, Bernie Plaza from Northfield, Massachusetts, a University of Mass grad. And over the years, 3 years that we were in Germany together, Bernie had met a Navy corpsman, and he married her after a couple of years in Germany, and she was back in the States finishing out her tour. I left for Vietnam, and Bernie came about 6 months later. And about halfway through our tour, I got a letter from Bernie in country. I was up near Pleiku, he was down near Saigon. And in this letter, Bernie said how happy he was because he had just found out that Mary was pregnant and they were going to have a baby. It took about 5 days for that letter to get delivered in country. And by the time I received the letter, Bernie was killed. Well, I kept that letter. And I kept it for years. This is 1966. About 10 years ago, I get an email from a friend of mine from Germany who had heard from Bernie's son, who had written magazines that asking if anyone knew his father in the Army. So to make a long story short, I contacted him. He's a school principal out in Washington State. And I got the letter to him and his mother that was the last thing his father wrote, saying how happy he was that Mary was going to have a baby. That's the kind of things you carried. I said that, the majority of service people in Vietnam were happy to be there because we felt that we were doing the right thing. We were helping those people. And in some cases, trying to help them out of, literally out of almost the Stone Age. And other people, the Vietnamese people themselves, were well educated, good people. I told you how I went right from Germany to Vietnam. I had no language training. We weren't allowed to speak French because the French had lost the war and that was considered colonialism, so, we didn't speak French. But my Vietnamese counterpart had been a German professor at the University of Saigon before he came into the Army, the Vietnamese Army. So here is an American and a Vietnamese speaking German in the jungle so that he can translate it to Vietnamese or to another interpreter to translate it into Dry, the Montagnard language, so that we could communicate some way. Very well educated people. We learned a lot from them. I know they learned a lot from us. We brought technology that they didn't have. Like I said, the helicopter. And if you talk to a Vietnam veteran, maybe some of your grandparents were in Vietnam, what have you. The thing they all remember, the one sound that they all remember is helicopters. And even now when a helicopter flies over the house, I think about, the helicopter, it's either a dust off on the way to evacuate some wounded, or, that's just what it sounds like. And that's the one thing that you think about. In the things they carried, O'Brien doesn't talk very much about PTSD, and that's where the post-traumatic stress syndrome or disorder, and it's been called different things in different wars. And, World War I and II, I think they call it shell shock and all. And now we're discovering that PTSD is real. It's very common, and it can come from good things as well as bad things. If a soldier is the lone survivor in a vehicle that is hit by an IED in Afghanistan. He can develop PTSD because he's the only survivor. The same thing that happened in Vietnam. And they're discovering that even 50 years later, soldiers are being diagnosed with PTSD. And they deal with it in different ways. One of the really sad statistics that comes out of this is that we have veterans, after going through the trauma of war, committing suicide at an extremely high rate. And that's something that we have to deal with. We have to deal with it. I recently read a book. Now, by the way, what's not shown in the notes on the things they carried is that Tim O'Brien in 2012 received the Pulitzer, not the Pulitzer, the Pritzker Prize for his book. And the Pritzker Prize originates in Chicago with the Pritzker Foundation. Colonel Jennifer Pritzker started this, the foundation. The family owns the Hyatt hotels and they're multi-billionaires, but he is a retired Illinois soldier, National Guard soldier, and tries to help the military and authors and that sort of thing that tells the story of warriors. And it's a $100,000 award, and O'Brien received that in 2012. So, well done. But I recently read another book that is not about, it's not fiction. It's not made up war stories, or at least ones that you can tell, but it's based on fact. And it's called Fearful Odds. And it's by Charles Newhill III. And he talks about his experiences in Vietnam in 1968, same time frame as O'Brien, as a platoon leader with the 101st Airborne Division in the Ashell Valley. And his experiences that followed him after Vietnam, after he comes home. He was a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. Like O'Brien, he went to Harvard for graduate school and suffered from PTSD and did not realize it through all of this. And then something happened with his wife so that his 2 children end up with PTSD. And it's the most accurate book about the combat experience that I've read. And it's brand new, just came out this year. But I had never thought about the transference of some of these experiences that end up in the family, not just the warrior. So, one thing that none of these books tell you about Vietnam but it is absolutely true. It is just the most beautiful country you can ever imagine. The jungles are beautiful, the mountains, no skiing, but I did see it get down to 30, in the 30s one time, and half my mountain yards came down with pneumonia. But it is just the beautiful waterfalls, the birds, the flowers is just gorgeous. But there are some critters in Vietnam that you never hear about, you never read about, and that's tigers. Bengal tigers. And they got to be a real problem in that they were all man-eaters. I was working with Special Forces in 1966, and in the middle of a firefight, we had 2 of our mountain yards dragged off by tigers in the middle of a firefight. In 1969, they were also a problem. And I remember for one night in my, sitting in my bivouac area right on the Cambodian border, talking to my first sergeant on the back ramp of my armored CAD vehicle, and the shadow went by us about 8-9 feet long, and it was a tiger that was inside our wire and not 5 feet away from us when he just walked by. So they don't mention tigers, but they were there. So, do we have any questions? Can I help you with anything?
Go by.
Oh, just stand up, maybe.
So what other animals were in the jungle? Like, was it more like an Amazon jungle type setting, or was it like, I don't know, anything different?
Yeah, there were monkeys, which are nasty critters. Elephants, and North Vietnamese used to use the elephants as pack animals. Water buffalo, which are about the ugliest thing I think I've ever seen. Wild pigs, yeah. Not bunny rabbits and stuff like that. Jungle animals, yeah. Yes, sir.
Did you like hunt down animals when you were hungry, or like did you have Vietnamese food? What was the deal?
No, we had sea rations, which were just canned food. Actually, some of the sea rations that I know went back at least to the Korean War, if not earlier. And the U.S. units used to, like they would try to fly in, again by the ubiquitous helicopter, hot meal once a day. Yeah, so no, we didn't have to hunt for food, thank God, because I would have starved. Anybody else?
I had a quick question about like just general health effects. Like my grandfather served in Korea and he has quite a bit of hearing damage. Did you get anything like hearing loss or, just anything like that?
Yeah. My second tour in Vietnam, was commanding an armored cavalry troop. We had 9 tanks and 24 armored CAD vehicles, that sort of thing. We were on the right on the Cambodian border. And one morning, I sent one of my platoons out on patrol, and they were ambushed. And I reacted with the other 2 platoons, and we were in the middle of they had put down the ambush, and I got out of my armored cav, wearing a flak jacket, and a very brave young soldier from North Vietnam jumped out of a spider hole and shot me through the seam of my flak jacket. Not through the flak jacket, but through the seam. He was about 40 feet away maybe. So that bullet severed a rib on my left side, took out my left lung, nicked the pulmonary artery, severed my diaphragm, tumbled along my spine, so I had 3 compound fractures of the spine, and ended up in my spleen. And so I went down immediately, and that brave soldier from North Vietnam went to his Valhalla before I hit the ground, I think, because of my first sergeant. And as soon as I went down, I knew I was in bad shape. And so that triggered part 2 of the ambush, and so there was gunfire all around. And about 30 minutes after that, a helicopter came in and evacuated me to the hospital at Pleiku, which was the nearest. And by the time they got me into the dock, my lungs were collapsed, so I had no respiration, and I was bleeding out inside between the lung, the spleen, the artery, and everything else. So there was no blood pressure, so I heard the doc say, "You're too late with this one." At which time I hadn't passed out. I knew that if I passed out, I wasn't coming back. So I reached up and grabbed the doc by the throat, at which point we almost lost him. Well, I mean, kind of scary. And so they got me into the operating room, and the priest told me 2 days later that he gave me the last rites, and that the doc did open heart surgery, open heart massage during all that procedure, and kept me alive. But I was a paraplegic. So they air evac me to Japan, just like O'Brien talks about in his book. And then from there, eventually to the Boston Navy Hospital in beautiful downtown Chelsea, because that was closest to my family at the time. And I started getting better. I got some feeling back into my legs. Eventually, make a long story short, I made it. I was the only soldier that made it back on active duty from the Boston Navy Hospital. I had been selected to teach at West Point, so the Army said, even though I was on a cane, 2 canes at the time, we'll send you to grad school. I was supposed to go to Temple, and they decided I couldn't outrun the muggers in South Philly, so they sent me to Rice University in Houston, so I didn't have to outrun the muggers. And I graduated from Rice, went back, taught at West Point. I had students by the name of Petraeus, McChrystal, a couple of other guys. Bordiano, who just retired as the Chief of Staff of the Army. He was my Army football player. And make a long story short, I stayed in the Army another 24 years on a cane, commanded the tank battalion, was the program manager for the Abrams tank, a few other things. So, but one of the funny things is, right after I got to the Boston Navy Hospital, we got this new doctor, young doctor. And he's looking at my chart and he said, oh, it went through your lung, artery, diaphragm, 3 compound fractures of the spine, and I don't see how it missed your heart. I said, have you ever been shot at? He said, of course not. I said, well, when someone's shooting at you, your heart's about here, so it didn't even come close. I don't know if you could see that or not. Here, that's where your heart is when you're someone's shooting at you. Yeah, so I'm very blessed, and always have been. But I always had the question, you know, I wasn't meant to die that day. But what was I meant to do? So that's what I've been thinking about for a while now. Any other questions?
What did you guys do when you weren't fighting?
Pardon me?
What were you guys doing when you weren't fighting? Or were you always like, or were you constantly fighting?
Yeah, that's, we weren't constantly fighting, but we were constantly getting ready to. You know, training, maintaining equipment, especially if you're a tanker, you maintain equipment, because your life depends on it. One of the statistics I was looking up at, in World War II, the average infantryman fought 40 days in a year. In Vietnam, it was 240 days. More intense. Mrs. Cook, how are we doing on time?
We're good. We're good. Do you have any other questions? I know that, guys, from the articles, or what are you talking about today? Any questions? Any research? Oh, I see her
I guess we're good. Thank you so much.
Uncle Tim, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.